For those who don't know me, my name is Oliver, and I serve full-time as Nucleate's executive director. And it is my discreet honor to moderate today's fireside chat, how policy is shaping the future of the biotech industry. We are honored to be joined today by Congressman Jake Auchincloss, who represents Massachusetts' 4th District. Congressman Auchincloss brings a remarkable perspective. He served as a Marine Corps officer, a Newton City councilor, and in product innovation and venture development before being elected to Congress. He is one of our community's most powerful advocates in Washington. Our goal for this conversation is threefold. First, to introduce Congressman Auchincloss and his work to this community. Second, to set the stage for why today's science policy environment is unlike anything we've seen before. And finally, to inspire all of us as scientists, entrepreneurs, and citizens to engage more actively in our democratic process. Congressman, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom with our community. I wanted to start by just asking you to tell us a little bit about your background and give us the view from Washington as it stands today on biotech policy.
Oliver, good afternoon. Thanks for having me on. I grew up in the suburbs of Boston in a family of medical scientists, and I represent a district now that is the densest concentration of life sciences talent, I think, of any in the United States. The public health experts, the clinicians, the investors, the scientists who do the R&D to bring life-changing cures to market are on the sidelines of soccer games in my district. So I take tremendous privilege in representing them in Washington. It's one of the reasons I wanted to be on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over health and human services. And within that, the NIH, the FDA, the CDC, CMS. And I would say, there's broadly speaking, there's three things that we want the federal government to do for life sciences. One is we want the federal government to be an impact investor, which is to say to fund the kinds of things that this private sector does not fund because they have tremendous positive spillovers that don't get captured in private sector transactions. Most notably, of course, R&D, so biomedical funding through the National Institutes of Health, through the National Science Foundation, through NASA and the DoD to a certain extent. So I'm a major proponent for funding for the NIH. I've been arguing that we should try to get NIH funding or the overall R&D funding in this country up to 6% of gross domestic product. It's at about 2.5% now. So more than double. And that's in contrast to this administration that's looking to cut in half NIH funding. The second thing that we want the federal government to do for life sciences policy is to be a smart regulator, through the FDA, through the EPA to a certain extent for biologically derived products, to have evidence-based policies predictably inform the regulatory structure, because life sciences investors and entrepreneurs, they make 10 to 15-year bets on new technologies. And biology is complicated enough without having to worry about bureaucracy as well. And unfortunately, this administration, under the banner of cutting government waste, fraud, and abuse, has in fact added chaos and incompetence to our regulatory schema. We see the FDA purging top scientists. A former FDA commissioner told me that the FDA had lost 20 years of competence and credibility in the last 6 months by virtue of mass resignations and politicization. We've seen the NIH start to censor different types of words. They have a code 19 that is driven by an algorithm that is clearly scanning approved grants for verboten words like diversity or equity or underprivileged, and is canceling or at least freezing those grant funds. And I'm giving you 2 examples. I could give you 15 more, whether it's the corruption of RFK's top staffers, whether it's the commissioner's national priority voucher, whether it's the nonsensical rollout of most favored nation proposals. What we're seeing is uncertainty injected into an industry that requires long-term evidence-backed regulation, and an attempt by too many in this administration to replace safety and efficacy, which are the North Stars for FDA approval, with fear or favor based on ideology or politics. Just today we're seeing that uh, the administration is claiming that Tylenol causes autism. Um, we should be studying autism. That's an important field of study. There's indications that paternal age or environmental toxins may lead to autism. We should study it. I don't think it's Tylenol, and there's no evidence of that. And when the United States government makes these proclamations, it makes it very hard for uh, for scientists to trust that it's going to be the data that determines their product as opposed to a tweet. And the final thing that we need the federal government to do is to pay for value. Um, Unlike most other industries, the federal government is a major buyer, not just regulator, of the fruits of the bioeconomy, mostly through Medicare, but also through Medicaid. And we need Medicare articulating how it defines value and to do a better job of assuring industry that it will pay for value. So using generalized cost-effective analyses to capture the full value of new medicines, and to being open to different types of payment arrangements, maybe not just volume-based, but maybe value-based as well, that can create more predictability. So we need impact investing, we need smart regulation, and we need payment for value. And if we can deliver those three things at the federal level, we can sustain our edge on biomedical R&D and commercialization. If we don't, if we could succumb to the worst impulses of MAGA and MAHA, China is going to eat our lunch, and they already are vaulting ahead of us.
Thank you for that perspective, and that actually goes directly into my next question, actually, which was, really looking, because I think a lot of people, especially, people in areas of the country where maybe the life sciences industry isn't as much of sort of an economic driver of activity, sort of don't fully understand, I think, always coming from that sort of basic science angle of like why it's so important for us to do these types of things and maintain kind of, the dominance that we have in this space. But really, when you pivot it and you look at it from like a national security and a competitiveness angle, right? I mean, this really is a foundation, a core pillar of sort of the American dominance, that allows us to be, such a competitive and secure nation. So I guess could you talk a little bit about why biotechnology is, no longer just about healthcare, but thinking about biotechnology as a strategic asset for us and our national security?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's two elements here. One is within healthcare, and one is expanding the envelope beyond healthcare. Within healthcare, one thing the industry does a very bad job of is talking about its value proposition in totality. Each company comes to Washington and they talk their own book. This disease, this indication, this hiccup I'm having with the FDA, this clinical trial improvement, this payment methodology. It's very different from how other industries engage. The oil and gas sector talks about, they want oil and gas dominance, and they lobby for like the full suite of things, right? The automaker industry, same thing. It's not that they don't have internal competitions within those industries. Of course they do. It's just that they're more coherent. And I have argued to the biopharma sector that they need to do a better job of framing big mission statements around at least four missions. One is chronic disease. How are you going to help treat chronic disease across the US population? About 8 chronic diseases account for a huge majority of Medicare and Medicaid spending, for example. So if you talk about renal failure, heart disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, et cetera, like give real goals that the whole industry is convicted about. Jobs created across the United States, same thing, get the industry aligned. Dollars saved in terms of federal spending on disease. And then out-of-pocket costs, savings for patients, how we can do a better job on lowering out-of-pocket costs through the insurance companies. I'd like to see the industry align on those 4 kind of big goals, because it helps focus politicians on an end state. Too often, industry comes and talks about process. Here's what we need to change, but they don't help politicians envision the goal that we're driving for. This many jobs, this number of chronic diseases addressed, this much savings for patients, this much spending reduced under Medicare. And then outside of healthcare, uh, you know this, Oliver, but I agree. I don't think it's well enough understood. The bioeconomy is not just about medicines. It can be about food and protein, right? There's a huge innovation sector around how we can, cultivated meat, how we can grow more different types of food more efficiently. Textiles, same thing, and materials and energy. These are four sectors that can have much more geographic impact, geographic dispersion, and that there has been an underinvestment in the commercialization of some of those technologies. But we see the bipartisan support for them. Someone like Senator Todd Young in Indiana, for example, is someone who is a big supporter of the bioeconomy, not just because of medicines, but because of food, fuel, materials, textiles, energy.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, 100%. And I think that, I guess one question, or I guess, okay, so a couple of themes that I hear when I talk to people about these things and that I think we're seeing reflected in some of the Q&A, especially when you're, talking to this kind of scientific community, people really love, to be in the lab, to be focused on things that they deeply understand and engineerable systems, right? And I think a lot of young folks and a lot of scientists, I would posit, don't really see politics as like an engineerable system. But democracy is by definition an engineerable system. So for those that are out there that feel kind of disenfranchised with sort of the political narrative that's coming out of Washington, which I think is extremely frustrating and feel little power to change things, how would you advise them to get involved? How can you talk to people in a way that inspires them and shows them where they can best put their action to get some kind of outcome that they're going. Now, obviously, you're not going to change Washington overnight, right? But how would you advise for scientists to engage in politics in a way that is productive?
I think what electoral politics and biology have in common is that they're not deterministic systems, right? But they can still be engineerable. I would put forward three different outfits that could be uh, that are I think are helpful. One is Stand Up for Science. It's a new advocacy organization around, I mean, basically what I've been talking about: NIH funding, depoliticization of grant making, better FDA, et cetera. So Stand Up for Science is great. The second, and I believe the previous panelists were talking about this, No Patient Left Behind is doing really good work on, particularly around what NPLB calls the biotech social contract. This idea that um, the insurance companies, the biotech innovators, and the premium payers are engaged in a social contract where people pay premiums, which creates a market into which biotech innovators sell. And insurance companies, no one's asking them to do things for free, but we are asking them to not put unnecessary and unreasonable out-of-pocket barriers in between patients and access. I worked in insurance for 2 years. I understand moral hazard and adverse selection very well. Nobody is faking chemotherapy. Nobody's faking asthma to get access to these drugs. If you pay premiums and a doctor prescribes you something, you should get that medicine without any out-of-pocket costs. And any insurance company who says differently is putting profit ahead of their patients. And so we should fight that fight, and No Patient Left Behind is doing a good job of it. And then finally, uh, the Buy Dole Coalition has been around for a while, but it's focused really on the protection of intellectual property and particularly on the protection of tech transfer from universities to innovators. This is unfortunately critical right now because both parties, and I'll put this on my party too, have talked about marching in on patents, breaking patents, disrespecting IP protection. This stuff is anathema to innovation. You've got to respect IP. This administration is talking about like taking a cut of people's patents. I mean, it's banana republic stuff. But under Biden, there was discussion of marching in on patents too, also unproductive. So Biden always needs the help.
Yeah, 100%, and definitely plus one. to all of those things, and actually, in particular, both Stand Up for Science and No Patient Left Behind were at the in-person summit that we had back in August, and Colette was able to engage with a lot of our leaders, and the folks from MPLB did a fireside chat, and yeah, I think their fellowship applications are or will be open very quickly, so definitely encourage everyone to engage with their resources. The other thing that I would throw out there, and I think this for me is a personal story and very much a full circle moment to be on this call with you. But I really got more engaged sort of politically in thinking about these types of things when I saw you talk at the Convergence Forum about 2 years ago. So I think the other thing that I would say is like really go local. There are
Yes.
incredible people in local government, not necessarily in the House or the Senate even, right? That are doing incredible work and are amazing civil servants that are elected to their positions that represent, the town, the city level. Those people want to engage with their constituents. I mean, all politicians do, right? You can go to events, right? I mean, you and everyone in your circle, you have town halls, you have ways for the public to engage and sort of ask you questions and engage with your office. And that would be sort of something that I would definitely advocate for. And I think when you look at and when you hear sort of what's coming out of Washington versus when you engage with people at the local level, it's a very different feeling. And it does feel much more inspiring and much more motivating to sort of take that next step, right? Whatever that next step may be, for your journey. So let's see, we've got a lot of questions. Okay, so here's a question from the audience that I think is good. How crucial to you do you think it is to change the culture of anti-intellectualism in the US, i.e., instead of scientists having to consistently prove and vouch for the value they add to society, that it's just a given social good? Or do you think it's more important to train scientists in science communication for this reason?
Hmm. It's an interesting question. I guess I would say I think science is a long-term endeavor. The fruits of our scientific inquiry don't pay off in the next 3 months, right? They pay off in 10-year cycles. And so I do think you need kind of continuous, you need a muscle built up that explains the value of that to policymakers. And starting with Vannevar Bush and the Endless Frontier after World War II, they developed that bipartisan muscle. And actually, in Congress, it still exists. I mean, the NIH budget just went up under House Republican and Senate Republican appropriations. The report language around it, which is basically like the guidance from Congress to the NIH, was pretty good, actually. So even though this administration has gone totally Looney Tunes, Congress, like that bipartisan muscle, still broadly exists around. Yeah, we get it. R&D matters. Where I think what I think has changed is um, it's all kind of grown a little bit stale. I think the PhD and postdoc process. I think the NIH funding mechanisms. I think the bureaucracy and overhead associated with how long it takes to get that R1 grant. I think the role of the university, there is a sense that, okay, this system has worked for 70, 80 years. It's a little stale. It's a little tired. It's got a little bit slowed down. And the challenge for Democrats, I think, going to be going forward, and I've written about this, is how do we not just be reflexively defensive of the status quo for science funding, right? But actually say, okay, RFK doesn't believe in the germ theory of disease. That's a hard no. But we're willing to, like, as he breaks things and we come back in, we're going to rebuild them. We should do more replication research at the NIH. We should think about NIH doing block grants to different institutions that can experiment, do meta science experiments, maybe golden ticket or high risk research, or better fund younger investigators. We should think about whether their PhD needs to be 8 years, right? Before anybody even has the permission to do science, right? Like, I'm open
Certainly.
to all that stuff, right? So I think part of this is a long way of saying part of the way that we better communicate on science is to be open to um, refreshing ways of disrupting our status quo for science funding, and be willing to go after sort of shibboleths, particularly in the Democratic Party. Universities have a big role in the Democratic Party ecosystem, to be willing to say, like, actually, you know, maybe it's not great that you have to be a PhD at a name brand university before you're like allowed to do science, right? Like we should think differently about that. It's fine. Um, the thing that we have to defend is the scientific method, right? And that's what's under assault right now
Yes.
from RFK. I really can't emphasize that enough. But this is a man who knows the answer before he asks the question. That's dogma. That's not science.
That's a great answer. And I think the question, just to draw a parallel, when you're talking about there being sort of a muscle that has to be built up sort of consistently, right, to sort of maintain that narrative. I think you can say the same thing, about democracy, right? Not just intellectualism and science, right? But it's like, you know, systems tend towards entropy, right? And it does take consistent, constant effort always to maintain a position and to convince people, of your position, right? And I think that goes for something as broad as democracy and something more specific like that science is good, right? And it's for the public good. And I think that scientists are trained to be academic communicators, but not public communicators. And the public, is not academic, right? Most people are not in that space, nor do they have to be, right? They live
Yeah.
fulfilling lives. They have great jobs. They contribute to our economy and our society. They're not stupid for having questions about vaccine efficacy or safety, right? Anyone who has a kid who gets their gives their kid a vaccine, and sees them react to just getting a shot in a negative way can understand, right? That like, okay, people are worried about their children, they're worried about their health. So I do
Right.
think that, understanding how to communicate your science to the general public is something that really should be more central to every educational system we have in higher education and learning.
I think that's right. I will say, though, I don't think it's fair to ask scientists to also be politicians, to ask them to have to both one, do the great work of
Certainly.
science and then
Yeah.
also deal with all the bullshit around politics. Like we should hold politicians to account to say, stop peddling stuff that you know is not true just to score some cheap wins on the socials, right? Like it's my responsibility to go to bat for peer-reviewed, curiosity-driven research, which I do on energy and commerce. But it's too easy to kind of create a straw man and torch it. And unfortunately, a lot of politicians are succumbing to that. Look at Florida. I mean, Florida is going to bring back measles and pertussis, basically just to own the libs. And you're just like, really? Is that you feeling good about that now?
Yeah. No, 100%. I'll take another question from the audience because we have a lot of great engagement in the Q&A. So someone was asking, maybe switching more to sort of the talent side of biotech. Obviously, I think we've all seen the news and sort of experienced the panic of what just happened with the H1B visa regulations. I guess the question is, how does the recent change with that sort of regulation affect our international competitiveness in the biotech space?
If I had to guess, the single biggest detriment to the U.S. scientific enterprise will actually not be the IP stuff, the NIH stuff, even the FDA stuff that I'm describing. It's going to be the depression in our high skilled immigration, not just because of the laws, but probably more importantly because of the vibes. Um, it's very hard to get economists to agree on anything. It's very, very hard to get an economist who disagrees that high skilled immigration is probably the single highest impact input to the US economy. Um, and I see this in my own district, the xenophobia, the lawlessness, the thuggery surrounding immigration and immigration enforcement is making it much more challenging to recruit postdocs, PhDs, undergrads. They're still coming, fewer of them. They're looking at United Kingdom, they're looking at Europe. Some of them, particularly those who grew up in China, are looking at going back to China. Certainly, our competitors are taking advantage of this. They are offering funded labs and academic freedom. It's an unbelievable shame. I mean, the diseases of the 21st century, diabetes, Alzheimer's, cancer, they're going to be cured with an accent, and to be bullying these innovators is a pretty astounding own goal. Um, and it's not fully fixable, unfortunately. I think it's partially fixable with the new administration and the new posture, But I do think that bell has been rung now, and it's gonna be reverberating for a couple more decades.
Certainly. Yeah, I know we have a large proportion of the folks that I've worked with, in the lab. Some of the smartest individuals that I've ever known have benefited from the immigration policies that we've had in the past, and I think it's very concerning. I also think, just to your point earlier about sort of the uncertainty, right? I mean, the entire last 24 hours in the news and in all of the various Slacks and text threads that I've been on, have been around even just trying to
That'll get thrown
understand.
out, by the way. Yeah, it's going to get thrown out by the courts. I'm pretty confident, but exactly as you said, just another dose of chaos.
Yeah. Okay, so we had a question earlier in the chat. So in terms of, what sort of you're doing in your position, obviously you've outlined a number of the different, policy issues and how you
Yeah.
feel about things and what's currently going on. But what are you sort of personally doing in Washington, and what are your like top three priorities, like let's say for the next quarter, as we
Yeah.
approach major political actions and votes?
Yeah, let me highlight three on the healthcare front, just for this audience. So the first is reform of the pharmacy benefit managers of the health insurance corporations that are the middlemen of drug pricing. These pharmacy benefit managers are the ones who establish the formularies, decide which drugs are in the formularies, and then decide the out-of-pocket costs and the rebates associated with the approved drugs. And they don't invent any drugs, they don't dispense any drugs, but boy, do they make a lot of money off drugs. And these middlemen need to be reined in. I mean, they're Fortune 50 companies, and I can't figure out what value they create for anybody other than, their CEOs. So we've got to take them on. They're a cartel. We have bipartisan support. Elon Musk killed it last December. You can't make this stuff up. He tweeted about PBMs, and Speaker Johnson pulled the bill from the House floor. We're struggling to get it back onto the House floor. I've got legislation. I mean, I won't go down the whole rabbit hole, but suffice to say, we've got to enact federal legislation for pharmacists, for drug makers, and for patients, most importantly. Number two, I'm fighting RFK. I mean, you would think that there would be a lot of Democrats doing that. The truth is, there isn't actually. Maha has quite a hold on the left as well as on the right. Maha is much more popular than MAGA. RFK intimidates not just Republicans, but also some Democrats. And candidly, he intimidates Donald Trump because Trump understands that he has his own political constituency. RFK is also the most incompetent and corrupt cabinet secretary in this administration, and that's quite a high bar to clear, but he's vaulting over it. I won't again go into all the details, but this guy is making money left and right on vaccine litigation. His staff is making money on abusing health savings accounts with their, basically these wellness grifts. And he has not the faintest clue, how any of the agencies he's in charge of actually work. NIH, CDC, FDA, CMS, not a clue. So we got to fight him. I've been going after him full bore. And then finally, I'm trying to do some things in a bipartisan, productive way for the long term, and particularly around clinical trial infrastructure. Everybody can agree that better, faster, cheaper clinical trials, a clinical trial infrastructure that's integrated into the point of care in this country, will radically lower the cost of drug development and just be a win for everybody. More shots on goal to cure disease, more patients enrolled, more diverse constituencies in these clinical trials. So more rigorous evidence. It's a hard set of policies to kind of get traction on, but we're in the midst of doing that. And I think it could be bipartisan. I think it will be.
Brilliant. So we had a question from someone else in the chat, kind of following up on what you had said in terms of, not putting the onus on scientists to always be politicians. I guess this person was asking for a little bit of help and sort of advice. So like appreciating the comments about how to stand up for science without having to sort of uncritically defend the status quo. But can you speak more about sort of how you do that without sort of falling into that same narrative of polarization that might be driving, the two sides apart in the first place? Like in a way, how do you, to someone who is maybe not a scientist, kind of stand up for science, without being apologetic, but also without coming off as someone who is just sort of feeding into this right versus left narrative.
Yeah, I'll tell you one way that I do it, which is I hook into a recent event that I know is still resonant with a lot of people, which is the school closures during the pandemic. So what I say is the school closures were a catastrophe. They were a catastrophe that is still reverberating around this country. 25 million American students now behind on reading, writing, and math. And the school closures should not have happened. Okay. The What happened was politics contorted what was still a fragile and emerging epidemiological debate. And I know this because Ashish Jha, who was Biden's COVID coordinator, is also my constituent. And in May of 2020, he was saying that both socially and epidemiologically, the schools should be open. Yet there was that, looking at what Australia was doing and look at what some Northern European countries were doing, you could see that it was fine. And we didn't do it. And we didn't do it not because of science, but because of politics, because the special interests captured the debate and public health boards got way over indexed to fear opposed to evidence. But I say all this to say, here's an example of something that was really impactful and I would argue traumatic for a big chunk of this country, the school closures. And it was an example of where the science was misused by politicians. And what we have to prevent is that happening again. And RFK is doing it now on the right by misusing the science for his political ends around anti-vax ideology. And if you frame it that way, you get some credibility by calling out what is to me my own side. The Democratic Party was really the party of the school closures. And then I have credibility to talk about on the right. And the key has to be that science is subject to the scientific method, to peer review, but not to politics.
It's a good message. I like that. Science is accountable to peer review in the scientific process, but not politics. So answer to Ethan's question there with a nice tagline for that. Okay, let's see. Other one. Yeah, so I guess, you had talked a little bit as well about, kind of the system going a little bit stale, right? And sort of, wanting to have a discussion around, okay, well, what's not up for debate is peer-reviewed science, right? Like germ theory. What is up for debate is maybe some of the ways in which we actually fund or push research forward, right? So I guess in that light, um, what are your thoughts there in terms of some of the things that you feel are most stale that you would advocate for more people on the left to look at sort of critically within these types of systems?
Yeah, so I think a few things. I'm an avid reader, first of all, of Stuart Buck, and Stuart Buck at the Good Science Project talks about a lot of different meta science initiatives. I think what I think is pretty true and pretty hard to sort of push back on is evidence that at the NIH, the funding rewards later career researchers who are doing incremental work, that it's small c conservative. And fundamentally, we should flip that narrative. And I think what the NIH can do is it can give out a bunch of different block grants, or it can do this internally. I'm open to different ways of thinking about it, where it experiments with different scientific funding mechanisms. So, one that kind of gives a golden ticket to one of to peer review to reviewers, so that really contrarian high risk research gets rewarded more frequently. One that looks at how to incent younger researchers. So I think there's a whole bucket of like meta science initiatives that the NIH should be experimenting with, including just giving more money to people rather than to projects, just to say, we're going to kind of shotgun this to really promising researchers and let them pursue with a lot of academic freedom, a lot of scientific freedom, their best ideas for a set amount of time. And we don't do that enough at the NIH, the National Science Foundation. They've started to do this person, not the project stuff, but we can turbocharge it. I think the other thing is we have a lot of different companies now pursuing basically like automated research in various capacities. Ginkgo Bioworks, Thermo Fisher, Lux Capital is investing, Lilly's investing in this. And I think it's really going to force us to reconsider the whole PhD and postdoc model. Like it's just, I think we should just get people involved in science just younger. And this whole like period of indenture that we require, that was meant to create some inexpensive labor to do medical chemistry. I'm not sure that's really the best model anymore. I'm not sure I have a replacement that is brilliant, right? But like we should afford much more experimentation from universities and focus research organizations, the ARCs in San Francisco, the arenas here in Boston. All right, you tell us, like, go find some brilliant high schoolers who are great at math and science and, put them in the lab. Like, I'm open to it. Um, but it all comes down to the willingness of funders to take risks with their dollars and not just conform to the typical model. There's also a model, I'll close with this, like a marketplace for science funding, basically to create syndicates, right? So you have a scientist who wants funding for basic research, you have philanthropists on the other side. Too often that is driven by, candidly by emotion. It's, that a funder's family member is affected by a disease. There's always going to be a place for that. That's fine. But I think markets are very efficient. And what happens if the NIH, did the peer review process, and so you had it de-risked, and then the NIH took the first tranche of funding, and then philanthropists could pile in, and you could syndicate funding. We do this across markets for a whole host of other products, but you create a much more efficient marketplace where you can stack up your funding much more rapidly. I know that's being experimented with as well.
Yeah, no, those are all great. Those are all great ideas and great areas, sort of pressure points, right, to think about in terms of how we can really improve and sort of, not just release bottlenecks in the system, but really change the way that we fund and do innovation. I think I very much resonate with all of the ones that you said, but in particular the talent, aspect, right? Speaking as someone who recently graduated from a PhD program, and also speaking as someone who was enabled at an extremely young age, probably an irresponsibly young age, to do biomedical research in a BL2 laboratory setting. I am a firm believer that you cannot be too young to like be in the lab and be given the opportunity to do real science. That is something for me that really drove my path to the PhD and to where I am today. And I think affording others that opportunity is really important. And I think in some ways too, just the bureaucracy of academia prevents that, right? I know my first time that I got into a lab, my mentor basically lied to the institution and said that I was like 16, but I was like 14 because they had this like age limit restriction. And I also have had experiences where we've tried to bring undergrads into the lab that I was working with as a PhD student, and we weren't able to do it because we couldn't find a funding source. And that person was like, well, actually, like I have a scholarship, but then it wasn't enough money to be like the exact cost of living that Harvard required. So they basically denied the person, even though they had a funding source. It like wasn't enough, or like it didn't come from the right source. So I really do think getting people into science younger in a real way, not just in a let's learn about it, but in like a here's a pipette, like you're gonna learn to pipette and make some serial dilutions type of way is really important. And I guess that also links to another question that someone asked in the chat, I guess, linking on that sort of idea, with the federal funding under pressure and cuts in academia, not only are people uncertain about pursuing a path for a PhD, but in some cases, people are getting their applications rescinded from PhD programs that they were, I guess, admitted to. Like, from your perspective, is it still a good time for early career researchers to enter this path, or do you see better opportunities emerging as funding priorities shift? Yeah, what advice would you give to someone, I guess, who, let's say, just got into a PhD program and then had their application rescinded?
First of all, I'm sorry that happened. Um, Second, yeah, I think you stick with it. Uh, the funding is going to be there. The NIH funding actually has bipartisan support. It's not going to get halved like the president is proposing. I'm not saying that there's not going to be a lot of dumb and counterproductive policies. There will be, but fundamentally, I think the money is not going to dry up overnight. Um, and while the politics is tough, the science has never been better. This is the century of biology, and uh, I think um, ultimately the dollars are going to flow to the frontier of science. And I know AI gets all the hype these days. I remain convinced that foundationally, um, it's going to be genetic editing and biology that's actually going to be more disruptive to the 21st century than AI.
Brilliant. I uh I also do firmly believe that biology is the ultimate engineer. And I think
That's right.
we have only yet started to get to even 5 or 10%. And I don't know if we ever truly will, get to sort of on the level of, true evolution mastery of systems. But it is the ultimate engineer, and I'm a firm believer that investing in doubling down in the way that we perturb and engineer biological systems is a great investment in terms of the outsized impacts that the effort can have there, especially when we look
And
to climate.
Oliver, totally. And just as an example of that, again, drawing on AI, the human brain for the energy of a light bulb does more computations more effectively than a data center does with the energy of 1.2 million homes. So if you don't think that evolution can kick ass, like just watch what this data center can do to outperform the cutting edge of AI research right now. I think I just finished reading this terrific book, A Brief History of Intelligence, that goes through the 5 different evolutionary jumps in the evolution of intelligence, and it just really kind of reinforces like how good biology is, and as you said, like how much it's untapped. There's an old expression like, "Oh, this doesn't grow on trees," as a way of saying like, this is not abundant, and it's because trees, are the best factories. Like, if you want something to grow abundantly, tap into biology.
Certainly. And, large language models would certainly not exist without language, which would certainly not exist without us, and silicon computing wouldn't exist without natural computing. And, now people are looking at, to your point about scaling, right? Silicon scales exponentially with every query, but neural networks are linear, right? So there is a world now where it's all coming back, right, to how do you integrate that sort of large language model and neural networks into actual neurons through natural computing, because ultimately that is the most effective way to do those computations. Now, I know that we don't want to keep you too much longer. I know you have to hop, but
Yeah.
I guess with the minute we have left, what advice would you offer to kind of the next generation of biotech leaders in these difficult and potentially concerning times? What do you want to leave our audience with here today?
Um, oh, Stick with it. First of all, the science. And second of all, turn politics on mute. One of the things that is driving so many people around me insane is um, the cacophony of politics. It's social media, it's cable news. It just feels like it's everywhere. It's like suffocating. And the thing is, and I know this because this is my job, the signal to noise ratio is very, very low, right? There's so much talking. And then if you actually derive out the actual policy signal, the actual thing that changes your life from all the endless talking and bullshit, it's very, very low. And so the healthiest thing you can do is honestly just put it all on mute and like tune in a very disciplined way to things that really you think matter. Um, because otherwise we're all gonna go to bedlam otherwise. I I mean, and this is my job, and I still turn most of it on mute. So please do that and focus on the science because there's a lot higher impact in the science than in the politics.
Great message to end with. Thank you so much, Congressman Auchincloss, for your
Thank you.
perspective, for your wisdom, your time, and your service.